Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. I'm going to start this off. All right. So this is the Neuroscience Investing in Emerging Sectors webinar. We decided to try something different. We have a couple of panelists from the investment side, as well as our own CEO of MetaCell. So a little bit about MetaCell. We develop software to share neuroscience data and models online, creating compelling visual and collaborative experiences. I'm not even seeing my, sorry. There we go. All right, now can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Awesome. So yeah, MetaCell, we develop software to share neuroscience data and models online, creating compelling visual and collaborative experiences. We're world leaders in neuroscience software, web, native, and mobile, scientific software development, deployments internal to organizations as well as external to the public, PhD level neuroscience, agile development, and continuous integration feedback with clients. So these are just some of our clients: Pfizer, Biogen, UCL, ASU, OneMind, INCF. And so today's webinar, we are joined by Valerie Photos, a partner at Iaso Ventures, Avery Bedows, a Neurotech investor at Loup Ventures, and then our own CEO, Stephen Larson of MetaCell. Thank you guys. How are y'all doing?
Great.
Doing
really
well.
good.
How are you, Priyal?
Awesome. I'm doing well, thank you. So if you guys could each just kind of introduce yourself, your business, and why you're a panelist and what you're looking to get out of this, I'd love that.
Stephen, want
Do
to
you
kick it
wanna
off?
start with
As let's have Stephen kick it off as the CEO here.
All right.
Sure. Well, thanks everybody. I've been hosting some of these webinars myself, so it's really great to have Priyal taking the lead here. My name's Stephen. I've been in charge of MetaCell here since we co-founded it together with my two partners, Matteo and Giovanni, for the last 8 years. It's been a great ride. We serve both folks on the academic side and on the industry side. The exciting thing is that every time somebody's doing something with neuroscience, inevitably in this era, that has to touch a computer one way or the other, and that means that software is going to be in the mix and is going to be a critical component to helping us better understand the brain and work with the brain and the brain's information. So I lately have been looking at companies that are emerging and growing to understand what their data challenges are, to better get a sense of where things are headed. And so I'm excited in this webinar to talk to two folks whose opinions I really respect about what they're seeing as well in the neuroscience space with Avery and Valerie, and get their perspectives, and then also share my perspectives from just the perspective of a service provider. So really glad to be with you.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Avery, Valerie?
Go ahead, Avery.
All right. So my name is Avery Bedows. I'm the Neurotech specialist at Loup Ventures. We are an early stage frontier tech fund, venture capital fund. We're based in Minneapolis, although I'm located in New York. And while we invest across a number of verticals, one of our focuses that we've really gone into is neurotech. And so I lead that vertical, and I look at stuff kind of ranging across the neurotech board. And what I mean by neurotech board is, I think, something we're going to talk about in a couple minutes here. But it's fantastic to be here, and Priyal and Stephen, I of course really appreciate the invitation, and Valerie, I always enjoy our conversation, so I'm excited about this.
Great.
I'm also really excited too. So yeah, so my name is Valerie Photos. I am one of the co-founders and a partner at Iaso Ventures. We are a new venture capital firm that's focused on neuroscience and behavioral health investing at the early stage of company's inception. So we have been out since about January, so about the last 5 months, seeing a lot of different early stage companies out there, raising our capital, and really trying to be the top and only firm that focuses on this sector. So I'm happy to be here with all of you, and I'm excited about today.
And I also, of course,
Thank you,
I'd like to jump in there real quick and give a lot of praise for Valerie and Wasim. It's she and her partner Wasim are fantastic, and it's exciting to see new people enter into the neuro investing sphere. It's a small group, but it's a good group.
Very much so. Thank you, Avery. And I'm Priyal Sheth. I'm the EVP of Client Relations at MetaCell. I joined MetaCell back in February. So now I'd love to get some engagement with the audience. So two things. First, please, audience, write your questions so we know what you're interested in, and I can kind of field them between our panelists. And then secondly, I'd like to start off with this poll. Who's from academia and who's from industry? Give you guys a minute to answer. All right. Wow, there's a lot of voting quickly. All right. All right, so we have about a third from academia, it looks like, and 2/3 from industry. Let's give it 5 more seconds. Oh. Okay. I was expecting more from academia. That's pretty interesting. Okay, so we have a better idea of who our demographics are. So as Avery alluded to, let's start with the question. What is the difference between neurotechnology and neuroscience? I'll defer to whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll grab this. I got this. So I define neurotech fairly broadly, probably more broadly than a lot of people would. And the way I define it is a neurotechnology product or a neurotechnology company. Let's go with product. A neurotechnology product is a piece of digital technology that somehow implicates the nervous system. And that can be either through sort of rigorous knowledge and understanding of the nervous system. That can be through recording the nervous system through some modality, and that can be through modulating the nervous system through some modality. As some examples of things that fall into this, you of course have your invasive brain implant at kind of one end of the extreme. You have on the other end of the extreme mental health apps, particularly those that are based on kind of rigorous clinical validation and where you have scientists working on it. And of course, in the middle, you have computational neuroscience companies. You can probably include neuromorphic chips companies, a lot of other stuff in there. I personally exclude biologics from that definition. Those aren't technological in the, I suppose, classical sense, although even that, there is some crossover if you pair a biologic with a digital platform or something to that effect. So that's how I define it, and that's how I define the scope of what I look at Loup.
Great.
Valerie?
Yeah.
So I largely agree with what Avery is saying, although I think that our definition depends a lot on the community in which we were raised. And so coming from a psychiatry/clinical psychology framework, I was brought up to think about neuroscience as the study of the brain. Although I'm aware that in my clinical settings now, we talk about neuroscience as inclusive of all of the diseases of the brain, and so things that might, otherwise be called neurology if you were from sort of a different era. Also coming from a kind of behaviorist background, I'm very well aware that there are many things that we do in our lives that have to do with learning that heavily impact our brain. And so, for instance, if somebody implements like a really rigorous exposure-based protocol for obsessive compulsive disorder, they actually can cause the same sorts of brain changes in a patient as a biologic or as a neuromodulation device could in terms of, a treatment. And so I think of neuroscience as all of the things that act upon the brain. The tech part, if you want to have this broad definition, it can include everything from learning applications and apps all the way to invasive things. But I think my definition is probably a lot broader than Avery's is.
Cool. And yeah, let me throw in then to round out the definition on the neuroscience side as opposed to the neurotech side. My background, I looked a lot at the structure of the nervous system. And this is also relevant to some of the data sets that we focus on a lot, things that come from MRIs, PET scans, anytime that you're taking a picture of the brain, or even when you have multi-channel EEG on the scalp, having a sense of the difference between the underlying anatomy at one part of the brain, say the frontal lobes versus maybe motor cortex or visual cortex. And all the different kinds of multi-scale structure that's in the nervous system is all part of things that I think of as neuroscience, and which data are able to address at different levels. And so some of the fun challenges that I see on the software side of neurotech is how does one take these data that are collected from measures at different scales and in different methodologies and put them all back together again. It's a little bit like Humpty Dumpty, where all the pieces are all scattered, and the real challenge is how do you fit all the fragments back into the jigsaw puzzle to make it go. So that's kind of the neuroscience, and then some of neurotech on the software side, I think, is a little bit about fitting the pieces back together.
One question I would have for you guys, because this is something I think about a lot, is, and Valerie sort of alluded to this, how do you think about a situation where the model you're working with is not biological nature? So you're looking, let's say, at a purely behavioral model, where let's say we want to pick a signal to optimize or to control, and that signal is phone usage patterns, as an example. And so that's the behavior we're defining, and we are having some sort of intervention to modulate that behavior. And that's how we think about it. That is the system we're working with. We can posit pretty certainly that there's something going on with the brain, like a literal biological brain underlying that. But as the people developing this product or performing this research or running this company, we don't actively think about it. Would you guys consider that to be a neuro company? Or would you consider that to be something else? I don't even know what phrase we would use for it.
Yeah, I would actually just fundamentally disagree with that paradigm. I would say that the difference between a brain-based explanation for something and something that is behavior-based, and the fact that you can like look at a behavior and assume that there's something going on in the brain, I think that's a way that I don't think about the world. And so every behavior that we do has some correlate in the brain. We can know more or less about what that correlate is. I mean, but part of the reason that Wasim and I started Iaso Ventures is to help people who are more used to thinking about behavioral optimization actually sort of try to understand at least the best that we know about the neural circuitry involved in the brain and the changes that are associated with that.
So I don't know if we're disagreeing insofar as I think if I'm understanding what you're saying, it's that it doesn't even make sense only to think in a behavioral setting, like you sort of automatically want to start thinking about the brain basis. I completely agree with that. I think there are definitely people out there, though, who only think about things in a behavioral setting where that is a system they're engaging with. And so it sounds like you and Wasim wouldn't, if there was a company, you talk to the executives and all they were doing is doing, like, let's say, rigorous science on the behavior side, but hadn't even touched the neuro, that wouldn't be a neuro company to you. You may come in and suggest that they start to like look at the literature and explore the neuro side more so. That's kind of what I'm getting, is that you don't think there should be that distinction.
I don't think there should be that distinction. I think that somebody that came to us, if they were to do so, would already be thinking about the fact that they would like to transition to thinking about themselves as a brain company or as a neuro company. And we would absolutely support their engagement with sort of our community of people to help them understand how to rebrand or remarket themselves with new information coming in, with new science, with sort of the basic building blocks that they would need to launch a research program that was rigorous and scientifically as modern as possible. And so one of the things that we encounter a lot are people who have some understanding that they may have gotten when they were in school 15, 20 years ago, but they actually know that, there's been leaps and bounds of changes in both the way that we frame how the brain, kind of goes wrong with pathology, as well as the way in which we understand learning mechanisms. And so a lot of what we would be doing is helping create protocols for people to measure the types of endpoints that somebody that has a neuroscience company would do, as opposed to somebody that has a behavior change company, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just slightly different endpoints, a little bit of a different maybe in the type of data they have to collect in terms of whether it's wearable data, whether it's actually passive data for biomarkers, whether it's active data put in by the patients, whatever it is, to really think about what the endpoints are from the perspective of a neuroscience company.
Okay, I think that is a perfect segue to the next question. What do you think of Neurotech moonshots versus Neurotech desperately needed? Because I know Valerie's background is very much clinically oriented. Avery comes, correct me if I'm wrong, Avery, more on the consumer end and kind of like high level understanding, or something you want to synthesize that a little? Okay, but anyways,
unusual background, but for a different time.
So yeah, Neurotech moonshots versus Neurotech desperately needed. Thoughts?
I mean, I don't think there is such a thing as a Neurotech moonshot per se, and I think I think Neuralink in particular kind of proves that. They started 2 years ago with a 30,000 word article talking about the fusion of human brains with artificial intelligence, and then 7 days ago, last Tuesday night, had an event in which it became extremely evident they were doing what everyone else in certainly invasive neuro has to do, is build a device for a medical use case and go through the FDA just like everybody else and hire scientists who have trained working on medical applications. Another way to look at this is if you look at the difficulty of a neurotechnology company, and you look at the distribution of difficulty and time it takes to develop, and compare that to the broader distribution, you see something different. In the broad distribution, we have, let's say, Bird, or like a scooter company on one end, and we have a quantum computing company on the other end. These are very different difficulties, and their growth curves are extremely different. Whereas if you look at the distribution just of neuro companies, I think it's much tighter. And what that means to me is that there is no notion of a moonshot. Like, there isn't a company that's so enormously more difficult than any other company, because the steps that each company has to go through are roughly the same. You can't like leapfrog per se. So that's my take on it, is that there isn't such thing as a moonshot. You kind of have to go solve some sort of problem, which tends to be healthcare.
Valerie, your take.
So, I mean, being in venture, right? So we are a business where we look for moonshots and unicorns, and we look for the kinds of companies that are going to shift and really change the landscape of what we're all working on. So with that in mind, I really do think that because we're a burgeoning field, especially with health applied neurotechnology, I a lot for the fact that there are going to be major defining variables that come from some of the biggest or most successful companies, which I hope that we're a part of. On the other hand, one of the great things about doing venture as well is that, as you're trying to really shape some of the moonshots or unicorns that are out there, you can also really be paying attention to the things that are going to make a difference in patients' lives, like right now. One of the things that I think about a lot in terms of working outside of the pharmaceutical world is that some of the quote unquote like life-changing or game-changing interventions are going to come from biotech, right, from pharma. And so that's wonderful. And in the meantime, there are still Alzheimer's patients, there are still patients with depression, there are still performance issues, there are still workplace problems that can be solved in a way that the technologies can come about in 2 to 6 years rather than 12 to 16 years, right? So in the large hospital systems that I've been working in, we still need a lot of help figuring out how to do our notes. We still need a lot of help tracking patients over time. We need a lot of help getting patients in that haven't been able to access care because they live too far away, or because they can't get transportation, or because they're too sick to get out of bed. And while those things, I think, are companies that could come out and become moonshots because they encompass solutions, they also intervene in a way that makes a difference, like tomorrow, in patients' lives. So that's the vision that I hopefully will see, kind of playing out. Stephen, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, so, my take is that I've been very close to the science recently. And I think about the developments that are happening just on the research side, that all of which are exciting. I mean, you go back, we're at 50 years now since the MR scanner was invented. Richard Demadian getting some credit for that. Think about how much just having the ability to look inside the skull without having to open it up has given us insights. Now, there's still a lot more to do, and there's concerns about low resolution, whatever. But that was hugely transformative. And I've had mentors tell me that they could not possibly have imagined that such a technology could even be built. It was completely science fiction. The idea of using magnets to see inside the brain. If you think about it, it's really quite wild that you can do that. And I wonder, going into the future, how some of the things which are now being used in animal studies, you look at optogenetics, things that are not really ready for humans for lots of reasons, for ethical reasons and safety reasons and whatnot. But as we go forward, we'll see how they could potentially be applied for therapeutic use. Possibly, you could imagine, a therapeutic reason to stimulate certain circuits, with light, some sort of a surgical, procedure. So there's the question about like identifying the companies that are going to bring these technologies forward. I think the first prerequisite is to identify what are the technologies that are going to really, make it into the next step. And, I think it just takes a few technologies that are not FDA approved now to become FDA approved to unlock a whole new area, avenue potentially of investment. So I think it's quite exciting and it's quite fast paced, and you kind of have to be able to see both sides. And I appreciate in conversation that we had, Valerie, about the focus on the science and the focus on what is scientifically, rigorous and possible, because I know that there's a lot of, it's easy to wave hands and sort of get excited about, one publication in a mouse, one place, right? And then kind of run away with it.
So Stephen, you said recently you've really been close to the science. I'd be curious, what have you seen there that is exciting to you? And you also sort of mentioned that if a few things go through the FDA that aren't through the FDA yet, that could be a big deal. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, to be fair, I'm not like thinking about something that's specifically on FDA docket today, right? But I mean, right. Technologies like, approval for, for doing things like using optogenetics, potentially, if we were ever to get to a place where that kind of thing would be approved, or I don't know, even more FDA approval for some of the brain, machine interfaces in different contexts where you're not just trying to restore, somebody's function and like who's been paralyzed, but to use it in other contexts, things like this. So those are some things that I think about. And we'll see in terms of other therapeutic applications of EEG, for example, other therapeutic applications of stimulating the brain in all the various ways. There's a lot of black art around that right now that is also does not a lot of great science, I think, to prove that different kinds of stimulation are definitely, clinically effective. And so I think the FDA is right to not necessarily say that you can prescribe stimulating someone's brain today to address specific diseases. So there's efficacy that has to get shown as well. But again, if those things get proven, if the science is there, right, and suddenly you have something which flips from being like a black art into something that is more well accepted and well understood as actually having a benefit, you might have things move. Look at the current excitement around the relationship between the gut microbiome and Alzheimer's. Okay, so there's some idea now that actually a source of misfolded proteins may be coming all the way traveling from the gut up through some of the cranial nerves, making it into the central nervous system and then into, which is like a wild hypothesis. If so, if there's a way to treat Alzheimer's or prevent Alzheimer's through diet or managing diet, then that would unlock a company. So none of these are things that are currently on the FDA's docket. I have to stress that these are things that would have to have some development.
But hypothesis stage, exploratory stage.
But I'm just saying, inspired by the way that we've seen MRI, go from a complete wild idea of a technology to something that is now we're all just like, oh sure, yeah, we'll just look inside our brain with this magnet system. Similar things could happen down the road. So
I agree with you, and I'll add one thing. I think it's a really astute point, which is that it's not only a new type of technology that allows us to understand the brain better, but actually a new way in which we speak about the brain. I think a lot of us are still stuck in the old view of thinking about neuroscience as localizing different kinds of functions or thinking about kind of an anatomical view of the brain. And I think as we learn a lot more about the underlying structures of some of the pathologies that go on that aren't using kind of a, in the Neurotech conference as a computer as a model for the brain, I think we're going to, be able to see a lot more of the kinds of technologies that we need to be implementing as well. I was telling all of them I'm involved in a class right now for sort of clinical psychology and the history of some of this stuff. And I think about what was considered a moonshot in 1960, so people were doing, lobotomies and saying that this was the future of neuroscience at the time. And anybody that knows me knows that I am a fan of invasive technologies. I think that there's a lot of fear about people, kind of coming into our brains, but I'm very excited for that to become more mainstream. And yet, it was within our parents' lifetimes that this was done in a way that was really misusing technology. So I think we have to be really sensitive to the history that we are, kind of building upon as well.
One thought I have, and this is actually something I'm not nearly as qualified as either of you to speak about, but wanted to lob it out there, is the way that there's presumably a lag between how academic training changes and then how industry changes afterwards. Valerie, you alluded to this idea of being trained on one thing when you're doing your PhD, and then 20 years later you're working on a commercial application, and you sort of the foundational, the bedrock of your knowledge comes from 20 years ago, whereas the current people who are undergoing their PhDs are learning new things. And so I'm just sort of curious what the relationship is between academic paradigms and commercialized paradigms. And Stephen, let me make this a little more pointed. Stephen, I'd love to hear about this in the context specifically of working with neural data and approaches to that.
Sure.
Great question. That's where I was going to go.
Valerie, do you want to start?
You can say a little bit, but I think certainly in my view, companies that are successful, don't just have academic or researchers kind of leading the way. Maybe have people who are really experienced in healthcare. That the team of people together brings that knowledge together, and so it isn't just relying on one person to understand the neuroscience of the product, right? It's the whole team together, and so I think those problems can be overcome.
One step building on that, Stephen. So can you talk about how neural data in general differs from, I guess, other types of data? Why it's so complex? And as Avery was asking, what are we currently doing, and how do you see it changing? And how does that mitigate risk when it comes to investors and I guess understanding what that looks like for neurotechnology companies?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that the definition of what's neural data keeps changing as we have new devices where we can innovate, or even a new molecular marker. Lately, think of something like PET scan, where you take a radioactive isotope that is bound to a receptor marker, and it will image different parts of your brain, like different tissues, or it'll connect with different proteins in your brain, so you get different patterns. There's been a wide range of new isotopes that you're able to put into the brain now and image in different ways using different modalities. So there's SPECT in addition to PET and various others. So neural data is itself a moving target. When we can image different structures of the brain or different kinds of function in the brain, things keep changing. And what that means is a challenging environment for anybody that wants to, number one, keep up with those things, and then number two, use them for research. So when we do our big pharma collaborations, they're constantly wanting to be in an environment where they're up to date with the latest tools and technologies, and they want to be able to ask questions where they can really slice and dice through the data. But I think one of the things that's challenging in human neuroscience in particular is you've got all this research, basic research that happens in animal models where you can be more invasive, and in humans for lots of ethical reasons and because our experimental methodologies aren't quite there, you don't. And so you have this large challenge of getting enough N for the data sets that you want to be able to make strong, well-grounded claims. And you have the challenge of also trying to look at people longitudinally. So when you're talking about disease states, to see people's progressions in Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, also takes quite a bit of time. So the challenge with neural data is that it's a moving target. But one big trend where people are trying to pull all this together is to find these things called digital biomarkers, right? And we actually had a whole nother webinar on digital biomarkers, so I won't go too much into them. But the idea is that we're looking for underlying signatures of disease by mining data that is coming from all of these different sources. So either mining data from the imaging modalities, or in other cases, movement, or even data related to where you go and what you choose to do. If we can measure that there is some disease progression, like we can tell if people are having cognitive decline in an Alzheimer's case, and then we sift through all the other data that we have about you, and we see what are the things that could be most correlated with that, and also have that with an underlying mechanism that we think is real. Then folks are trying to see if they can find stable indicators of disease that then they could potentially find some therapy to address. So I think what makes it interesting and exciting, but also really challenging, is how dynamic it is, and how basically something just becomes neural data when it touches on something that you know, the nervous system affects. Like Valerie's definition is right.
Even how much of the
behavioral.
innovation, like I think digital biomarkers is an interesting example. How much of the innovation there is happening in academia versus in industry? Because that also impacts who gets trained on it, and that further downstream impacts who goes and starts future companies or joins future companies working on it.
Yeah, I think it's a industry academic collaboration right now. So there's actually, I think just last year, Digital Biomarkers Journal just started. So we're really at the beginning of this, and at least the one I read, there was several of the articles were joint, like big pharma and you know, major university co-authors together, working together in partnership. So what I'm seeing is that it's a pretty hybrid sector right now, and I don't, you know, and so it may take one more generation of new researchers getting trained up in this for it to become more mature. I think it's kind of a wild west right now. I think that you know, I wouldn't necessarily you know, rely too heavily on anything that anybody today says is a rock solid digital biomarker. I think it's more what everybody is looking at. But as you collect more data, again, you can do more longitudinal studies. You know, if you can, you know, get some validation on these biomarkers, I think they could, you know, prove out. And one very specific example, right, where things get interesting is, you know, one of the companies I was working with was combining, you know, video and audio and, you know, really hardcore movement sensors put all over the body, but also working with data from an Apple Watch with the idea that maybe by using all the really high bandwidth data like the audio and the video and the movement, you could find a signature that you could actually also just pull out of the Apple Watch. So like one sensor, because really it wasn't like a high dimensional signal, it was actually a low dimensional signal hiding you know, in the high dimensional data. So what's exciting is that as we get better at this, you know, it might not take, you know, you going into a giant instrumented room to like understand, you know, what might be going wrong with you or how you might be progressing along a disease that you weren't even aware of. It might be things like, you know, consumer grade Apple Watch type stuff might be able to say, you know, where things are going. And that's important because, yeah, we might look to a future where therapeutics are not in a pill form, but they're in like modifying your behavior in some way, or it's an app reminding you to do something. But yeah, we need to know that that's an actual valid endpoint to bank on that.
Absolutely, and I think to support all of this, you know, even one step before that is becoming more careful and rigorous about diagnostic classifications of even some of the terms that we always talk about today, you know, and so even the types of Alzheimer's diseases that are out there, thinking differently about the different kinds of depression that are out there, and making sure that when we talk about classifying biomarkers, we're also thinking very carefully about what they're actually screening for, you know.
So yeah, along these lines, right, we're talking about healthcare and then prevention if you're measuring if it's disease specific, Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. But I know there's a lot of like biohacking. So what are some applications of neuroscience outside of healthcare that you guys see?
One of the things that I think a lot about is performance enhancement. So you can take a company that develops a product for spinal cord injury or for paralysis or for any movement type of disorders. That same type of technology can be applied to a workplace in which somebody's doing repetitive movements at a factory, or they can be applied to doing exercises for somebody that's in a performance enhancement place, like a sport or something of that nature. Same thing goes for ADHD, developing technologies for ADHD, where we can learn a lot about concentration and executive functioning. That can be useful in a disease state, but it can also be useful for people who are approaching a point in their lives where they're encountering more stress at the workplace, or they're tired because they have an extra child at home and they need to really hone in on improving their executive functioning and concentration skills. So I think about that a lot. I don't know, other people.
One thing that I think about a fair amount, and I don't think about it necessarily in terms of deep excitement, but more so deep interest, is sort of emotion technology, which in some way is the kind of consumerized or non-clinical extension of mental health technology. So, I mean, you can look at this in one sense as like the monitoring of emotion. So what sort of consumer experiences can you build when you can semi-rigorously, perhaps using a digital biomarker, track emotion over time? Do you make this available in an application like we have our step counts? Do you ping people with notifications when you notice that they had a day and they were stressed out? Do you create messaging applications that automatically take some predicted emotion state and suggest modifications or automatically modify the messages accordingly? So adding a GIF or adding color to it or the size of the font. Now the reason I say I'm interested and not necessarily excited is because I think emotion is considered by a lot of people to be a fairly sacred domain. I wrote something about this a while back. You can find on the Loup website about this notion of the wall of discretion, which is this construct where we have sort of these things internal to our experience, and then with more or less discretion, we decide what to externalize. And emotion is a thing that we normally keep internal and very selectively try and externalize. And of course, we give things away through facial cues and body language and tone of voice, but it feels very core to us. And so of course, you wind up with these ethics questions around the tracking of emotion in a non-critical setting. It makes sense to me more or less in a setting where you are trying to understand what elements of a patient's environment are exacerbating their depression over the course of a month. There's a clear need, there's clear suffering reduction. But if you put this in a healthy normal population, do the risks outweigh the benefits of having consumer applications that are informed by emotion? So that's sort of another domain that I spend time thinking about.
Yeah, I've got two. One is having studied neuroscience rigorously, I couldn't help but try to cross over what I thought I knew about neuroscience into some psychological states. So when it comes to productivity, so things like decision fatigue, like you get to the end of the day and you've been making all these decisions, and I think about it like,
or you've spent 30 minutes at IKEA.
Yeah, exactly. Or like mapping different states of mind onto neuronal structures, or like, oh, I'm very forgetful. Clearly my hippocampus is misfiring, or, things like this. And I think there is a degree of self-knowledge that comes from the advances that are coming in neuroscience. Trying to come up with a mental model that maps onto neuroanatomy is a place where I think neuroscience research is interesting, although maybe not as practical. But the other one, of course, that is really exciting is the way in which what we learn about the structure of the brain contributes back to things like AI. And I think it kind of I'll draw a line from Avery with the emotion thing, because it's the emotion part that very often seems to get left out when people are talking about, how do we make, intelligent agents, and somehow, we're going to get to do that without fully.
Right. We assume that like cognitive faculties are this thing totally devoid of emotion or bias in some sense, or intuition.
That's right. And there's been a lot of, to be fair, AI lately has been making a lot of leaps and bounds, and they seem to be able to casually ignore that. So, we're like we're beating Go masters, and we don't seem to and the algorithm doesn't need to be, we don't need to build frustration in. We're like we're killing people in StarCraft, and again, no, there's no sense that the algorithm is either happy or angry, right? And so it seems like there's a lot of room to go in that without some of those other pieces. But I was just reading a really critical article in the Atlantic. It just came out about it's 10 years since Henry Markram did this TED talk where he said, I think you guys here read it, where he said that in 10 years he'd simulate the brain. And this article was, I think, overly critical. I think it's fair to hold people accountable to certain public statements, but I think there actually has been a lot of advances in computational neuroscience, and I think that the effort to take all the things that we know about the brain and put them together to try to better understand how it works in health is actually has been productive, and there's actually been a lot more papers that have come out of that effort, that specific effort, even his effort, than he got credit for in that particular article.
How would you draw the line between computational neuroscience and modern deep learning? Like where's the overlap, and where is there just a clear distinction?
I think that's pretty, I think that part's, it's pretty easy because deep learning basically says the structure of the brain as such, we don't care. And computational neuroscience says we care a lot about the structure of the brain. Like we deeply care about some structural metaphor that is fairly close to.
And what about something like trying to use a deep neural net on brain data, like on fMRI data or on multi-channel EEG?
Yeah, so this is happening, and there's some productive things that are occurring. I think we talked on an earlier webinar a few months back about folks predicting Alzheimer's from fMRI using deep learning and being able to see signatures of Alzheimer's in patients 6 years before they're diagnosed in the clinic. Now that result, again, is early, that has to be borne out, but people, I mean, yeah, deep learning is getting applied to neural data in all sorts of exciting ways. And we'll see, we'll see how it gets better as we go forward. And then, another one that we talked about in that one was using speech patterns that you recorded from people that are going down the path of Alzheimer's, and even being able to detect in speech patterns when mild cognitive impairment is starting. Again, these are early days, early experiments are not fully validated yet, but I think that's really important. But at the same time, I think the project of unpacking the structure of the brain and how it's tied to function in intimate ways isn't something that's just going to fall out of an algorithm. We're going to be able to address specific issues, and look for patterns, but there is still a lot of like basic research that just has to be assembled together. So I think things will get interesting as we go forward, especially with groups like that are focused on databasing and simulating, that are in partnership with groups like at the Owl Institute, where they're doing the deep experimental work and making data sets available in ways where they can be mined into the future. Anyway, so you asked about things outside of like direct healthcare applications, and so I think about productivity and I think about applications to AI.
And just to build on what Stephen is saying, I think that what you said just a minute ago about more than just data, I think it's really true and really interesting. And so to take psychiatry and psychology as an example, we've developed many effective treatments for depression, OCD, anxiety, PTSD in the clinics, in the lab, and translated them out into the clinic. And yet everyone has to be delivered by a person, right? And so you have a clinician that has his or her own soft pieces of whatever they're doing in the treatment, the relational factors, the pieces that aren't just about what do you say and have the patient do. And actually, I think Neurotech is really very similar to this. If we're going to develop a virtual reality treatment for PTSD that people are going to take to their homes and do in concert with some sort of, fee-for-service treatment in the lab as well, in the clinic, then also what's important as part of that is the artistic side of the development of the VR platform. Somebody that's savvy enough to understand how to have people have an emotional experience inside of the treatment they're developing. And so I'm really excited too for the whole generation of artists, poets, people who do music that are going to be useful in terms of developing the healthcare applications for all of this. I think it's going to go hand in hand with the data scientists that most of us now are familiar with.
I recently, a good friend actually just launched a virtual reality exhibit in New York, and it's incredibly emotionally impactful. Like it's one of the most poignant, like individual fabricated experiences I've ever had.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, along those lines, what aspects of neurotechnology or neurotechnology markets are too mainstream or oversaturated on the flip side, in your opinion, Valerie, and then Avery?
For me, it's hard because, on the one hand, I want to say that it's, obviously people that are out there doing important things for health. I support all of that. I think that there's too many individual ecosystems out there in the US where people are recreating the wheel a lot. Right, because at the early stage of investing, they're, not at the early stage of company development, rather, you're not able to necessarily get a good differentiation on who else is out there in the marketplace. So, for instance, a conversation that I have a lot with people has to do with the content that's involved, that's included in some of the psychology companies. And so, for instance, many of the interventions are based on cognitive behavioral therapy, which is an effective treatment for many different disorders. However, as applied, there are newer types of technologies in the therapeutic sciences that are shown to be effective for people that maybe don't respond to cognitive behavioral therapy. And so, for instance, there's acceptance and commitment therapy, there's mentalization-based therapy, there are psychodynamic psychotherapies that can be evidence-based, there are exposure therapies, there's lots and lots of things out there, mindfulness-based therapies that can also be used as the bedrock of a digital therapeutic platform. And I think that right now people have a go-to for CBT, which again can be very effective, and we know it doesn't work in everybody. And so, you know, people thinking a little bit more modern in terms of the content that they're using would be a nice thing to see. Like just saying, you know, I do CBT to me doesn't tell me very much about what they do, right? Sort of saying like, I like pizza. Like, okay, what kind of pizza do you like? You know.
You know, that's interesting, Valerie, because
sorry, Avery, I just wanted to encourage the audience to send in more questions. I think we have about 10 minutes left. So yeah, just wanted to reiterate audience participation. Sorry, go ahead, Avery.
And also, I guess just to clarify there, I think the audience has a panel and there's a question box in there somewhere and you can type and send it. I'm not sure what the audience interface actually looks like, but I'm pretty sure it looks like that. But Valerie, that's interesting because, I mean, when I think about oversaturated, I think about oversaturated in the sense of like broader technology startups where like crypto feels really oversaturated. Autonomous vehicles feels like they're becoming oversaturated. And the only thing in neuro to me that actually feels like it has that magnitude of saturation is mental health apps, because I think they are the easiest thing to develop. And one of the reasons they're easy to develop is because it's easy to build apps relatively compared to like medical devices. The second reason is, Valerie, as you said, because the basic protocol is pretty well known. But whether the kind of easy version of implementing that protocol is good or not is up in the air. But beyond that, I mean, there isn't that much neuro tech out there. Just at the end of the day, like compared to almost any other field, there really isn't very much. So there's definitely room to operate, I would say. Like I'm seeing new stuff every day.
Yeah. And I'll just say too is that one of the amazing things that I have noticed, you know, after doing you know, very thorough scan of what's out there, is that the biggest problems don't always have the most solutions. So I would love to see a great solution for sleep, right? I mean, sleep is a huge problem, and yet the number of companies tackling sleep is smaller than the number of companies that are tackling disorders that are much less common. So I don't think that you know,
maybe there are a handful of companies tackling sleep. Which to me doesn't even come close to saturation, given the like magnitude of sleep and given the heterogeneity in sleep issues.
As an example, right? Just as one.
The one thing that's clearly oversaturated, and this is not for any company that falls into this category right now, because some of them that I know are doing great stuff. But I think, can we just call a moratorium right now to using the word neuro as the first part of your company's name? Because like that's it. Like at this point, like if you're like they're all taking that. Like just like the ones that are there.
I have multiple good friends who run companies that start with neuro, and I think it's the silliest thing. It reminds me of when
people. It's great.
Before I was in venture, I was working at a VR startup, and I was always so frustrated about companies that threw the like phrase AR or VR in the name of the company, myself included. I did it, and I shouldn't have done it. I think that is like the #1 sign, like the #1 diagnostic sign of an early field, is where people feel compelled to throw the name of the field in the name of the company.
That's right. That's right. So we're mature.
Yeah.
We're
no
mature
cog
when we
either.
that.
Neuro and cog can no longer be used.
Site, I think might be crossed off as well.
So I know Stevens runs, you know, a neuroscience company. You guys are investing in neurotechnology, neuroscience companies. How do the business models differ from neurotech to like normal tech, right? We've talked about there's this clearly the collaboration between academia and industry. There's an FDA component. There needs to be validation, right? And it's not just like a one person's going to solve it all. It's definitely a collective of scientists, researchers, healthcare-focused business executives, so forth and so on.
So I would almost argue that it's not so much a business model difference, because there are healthcare businesses and there are tech businesses and there are crossover businesses. And I don't know that neuro is intrinsically different from any other like healthcare crossover business. What's different though is the constraints you have because of literally where the signal is, or in the case of the peripheral nervous system, where the signal is, which means you have constraints on the devices, on the quality of the data and whatnot. And so I think those are the constraint functions that really are more of like a product difference than a business model difference. Because business model, if it's healthcare, you ideally try and get it reimbursed, or you can implement a new like non-reimbursed subscription model or something along those lines. So I'd say it's more on the product front is where the differentiation is.
So I had some audience questions. So back to, there was a discussion of digital biomarkers. What about eye tracking? That is becoming more ubiquitous and is tied to multiple indications.
Yeah, so we're very interested actually in eye tracking as a biomarker. You know, for diagnostic purposes, I think that this is a long history in psychiatry in terms of noticing that there are different sorts of eye movements, saccade movements that differentiate types of disease states. In terms of a quick and non-invasive sort of diagnostic, it seems very promising, especially for disorders that have a motor component to them. So many of the neurology disorders like Parkinson's, ALS, you know, they have a part of the symptoms that has to do with motor movement, as well as depression and schizophrenia, right? And so when you have that as part of the disorder, it makes a lot of sense that you can see in eye movements the classic, you know, threads of it. So we're very, you know, excited about many of those kinds of companies.
Speaking to the previous topic of a constraint, with eyes though, you need a product that somehow gets access to the eyes. And so that's a pretty tough constraint on what you can actually develop, right? We've all seen stuff with VR, with AR that try and use eye tracking or using a webcam or a phone camera or maybe a dedicated device. And so that's a great example of like, okay, great. Like we know what we need to look at in order to get the signal that tells us something about a motor disorder, but how are we actually going to do that in an ergonomic way that people are going to want to use?
Well, so there's two ways to go about it. One is if you're thinking about making consumer products or products for patients. The other is that you start with just trying to improve diagnostic criteria for instance, pharmaceutical trials. You know, so if you can help improve the ability for drug makers to have a better actual sample of people that have the same or similar disorder, then you can develop better therapeutics in the long run, as well as develop other sorts of treatments that benefit patients as well. And through that process, improve the technology to launch a consumer-based product. So it's kind of the business model side of things from our perspective.
Yeah, and I'm
so
wondering how much more. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Priyal.
No, go ahead, Tim.
Well, so thinking about
no,
you know, eye tracking as a you know, something that's you know, controlled by starting to get into your peripheral nervous system or your cranial nerves. I'm thinking about, you know, a lot of neurology, which is distinct from neuroscience, and that it's the, you know, the medical practice of trying to understand, you know, what's medically going wrong with your nervous system in particular cases. I wonder if either of you have come across any companies that are using full motion video to try and sort of do neurology diagnoses. Like, you know, today you need to sit in front of a neurologist and they need to kind of ask you questions and see if you might be like paralyzed on one side of your face, or there's a rule-based system is kind of what I'm saying in neurology, where you check different aspects of the cranial nerves. It would seem like you could, with full motion video and some kind of algorithm, start to like work out some of those cases to do some diagnoses, even on top of eye tracking. I wonder if you've seen any companies that are starting to go down that road.
I see people developing these kinds of technologies. In particular, the way that I like to think about the application of this is that we know that more experienced neurologists, more experienced psychiatrists are able, when somebody walks in, to say, oh, it looks like you are starting to suffer from these kinds of symptoms. And what I think we've long understood is that what they're actually looking at are the subtle changes in muscle movement of the face. What they're looking at is the subtle ways in which somebody moves their shoulder and the joints look differently, or the way in which somebody adjusts themselves when they're sitting, and that looks differently if you can't fill your lungs up because you have the beginning of a movement disorder. And so what we know is that sort of experience is translated into these like early biomarkers. So I've seen people developing companies around the way in which depression and other sort of mood disorders change the way in which you smile differently, right? So it's an intra-individual difference. So you have to have a baseline, and then from that baseline, you can notice when somebody is deviating from that baseline. I haven't seen as much success on group differences, but I think that that's just down the road. And then also certainly for the more robust movement disorders. I've seen people doing full motion, sort of full body movements.
And now, of
Yes.
course, on the topic of business models, this is something that lends itself really nicely to telemedicine, because I could be sitting here in front of my computer, and this first pass of diagnosis could be performed using this webcam. So that is also a sort of, that's the business modality that you could deliver it in.
And people have been doing this for a long time for autism, actually. And so like with little kids, before they're even able to really be diagnosed, with a developmental disorder, you can look at videos of them when they're much younger, doing the stereotypical sort of flapping movements and the variety of things that parents don't really notice to look out for until they're thinking there might have been a problem in the past. And so I think we've got like lots of great historical data to pull upon as well. So I'm pretty excited about the changes that we'll see from developing these technologies.
Great. So we have 2 minutes left. I'll just like closing remarks for everyone. And then I will share everyone's contact information and say thank you to the audience. Sorry, Stephen. Closing remarks, Stephen.
Well, I feel like this hour blew past me. I was very engaged, and I feel like we have the contents for probably 2 more hours to continue on. So I'm really grateful that you guys joined us. I was thinking a little bit more on what makes neuroscience technology a little bit different than others, and I think it's just that there's so much diversity, and that it's got so many different ways to kind of come at the problem. So I hope that if folks here got a little inspired, if they're working on their own companies or just trying to understand the space, I would just say that the possibilities are really bright, and I'm really hopeful for a future where we better understand the brain and use that to help a lot of people solve whatever challenges they've got, whether it be medical or productive or others. I think it's just a really exciting space, and I'm really grateful to be part of it. And thank you to both Avery and Valerie for joining me today and educating me on what things I don't know. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you too. I mean, Stephen, thank you, Priyal, for moderating, and Avery, it's always good to talk with you. The thing that I wanted to close with is that I'm just really glad that we live in a time where I think that brain science has moved from something that people feel really scared of thinking about. I think that many people started out believing that it's dangerous to them to be doing anything that might make an effect on their brain. Talking about emotions was at one point very scary for many people. I think we're moving into an era where people want to approach their emotional experience, where they are interested in having doctors know more about their brains, where they're willing to kind of open up and say, yes, you can do something to me that might change my brain and that might improve me. So I think that we're lucky to be in this time. And then in terms of what investing does, it's like, how could you not be, just thinking about how amazing it will be when many more creative companies come out to be able to do so, to look at our brains, to do something a little different to improve our lives, now that we're all willing to take it in. I mean, the major shift has been in the willingness of people to use this technology, which is then kind of, spurring people being able to develop this stuff. And so I'm extremely excited for the next, many years to come, where this is the kind of, birth of this field.
To sort of add my pile to add to the list of things to be thankful for, and to sort of steal something from Stephen, I am thankful for the heterogeneity of neuroscience and technology. I'm thankful for it in the sense that because there are so many different ways to think about the brain and so many different skill sets to contribute, that gives you a lot of degrees of freedom in trying to add value to people. Whether those are sort of healthy, normal users or patients who are suffering. And I think it's also sort of almost more selfishly, it makes it a really interesting field to be in. I every day talk to people who are experts in different things, who know much more about those things than I do. And you pretty much never will find two experts whose expertise is the same. And so it just makes it a fun field to play in. And so, of course, let me also throw the thanks back to Priyal and Stephen and Valerie for participating in this conversation and giving me that opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you all. And this obviously would be nothing without the audience. So audience, thank you so much. And I'm gonna share my screen, and now we have everyone's contact information. If you'd like to reach out to Valerie, Avery, Stephen, or myself.
Feel free to
thank
drop
you so
me
much
an
for joining
email
us.
I'm always happy to chat with anybody in neuro, whether or not you're working on a company or thinking about working on a company. I just enjoy talking to people. So feel free.
Great.
Likewise.
Thank you all. Bye.
Take care.